There are moments in life that don't arrive with fireworks, fate, or grand orchestral sweeps. Sometimes they slip in through the side door, quiet, a bit awkward, and entirely unscheduled. For Julian Reed, it came wrapped in paper coffee cups and Tuesday morning drizzle outside a downtown gallery in a city that never quite lived up to its potential. He was 23, barely out of undergrad, clocking hours as a research assistant for a professor who treated him like a post-it note with legs. He had no plans for the day besides sipping lukewarm espresso from an indie cafe and figuring out how to pretend he wasn't completely adrift in adulthood. That's when he saw her leaning against the railing in front of the Westmore Art Gallery, tapping a cigarette against a book she wasn't reading, dressed in clothes that whispered old money but looked like they'd been slept in. She didn't look like the kind of woman who would talk to someone like him. Not because she seemed better, necessarily, but because she looked finished. Like life had already broken her in and she'd made peace with it, while Julian still walked around with the open-wound optimism of someone who believed the next decision might finally fix everything. There was something in the way she didn't care about the drizzle frizzing her hair, the cracked screen of her phone she barely glanced at, the crooked heel of her left boot. She looked real. That rare kind of beautiful that makes you ache because it wasn't polished or filtered or curated, it was flawed and alive. Julian didn't approach her because he wanted to flirt. He approached because something inside him shifted in the presence of someone who didn't seem to be performing for the world. "Excuse me," he said, holding up his spare coffee. "I got the wrong one. It's too bitter. Maybe you like bitter." She glanced up at him like people did when they've already decided they aren't interested, then paused. Her eyes, a startling shade of ash green, narrowed as if she was searching his face for some hidden agenda. But there wasn't one. Not yet. Finally, she took the cup, more out of curiosity than gratitude. "Bitter's fine," she said, her voice dry but not cold, with a softness around the edges that made him think she used to laugh a lot once. They didn't exchange names. Not that day. He sat beside her on the gallery steps, watching as people passed by without acknowledging either of them. The conversation was shallow and strange about a mural that had just gone up near 12th Street, about why pigeons seemed immune to weather, about the taste of artificial vanilla. At one point, when she made an offhand remark about forgetting what day it was, Julian said, "I think that's a good sign. Only unhappy people track days like deaths." That's when it happened, the moment that changed everything. She looked at him, not just at his face, but into him, like she'd been waiting for someone to say exactly that without realizing it. And then she smiled. Not the tight, polite smirk people offer to defuse a moment. A real smile, the kind that felt like a forgotten muscle waking up again. It didn't light up her whole face like in the movies. It crept through her carefully worn-out exterior, softening the sharpness in her eyes and tugging the corners of her mouth upward in a way that seemed both involuntary and precious. "I haven't smiled like that in years," she said quietly, almost to herself. He didn't know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. Just nodded, sipping his own coffee as if the world hadn't just tilted slightly on its axis. She left without saying goodbye, leaving him with the empty cup and a brain full of questions he wouldn't ask. He didn't know her name, but he knew he'd see her again. And he did. 3 days later. Then the week after that. Always outside the gallery or at the cafe next door. Always alone. Always different, somehow, sometimes wistful, sometimes angry, once humming to herself like she was daring the world to stop her. She never volunteered anything personal, and Julian didn't pry. Not at first. But slowly, in bits and stumbles, details slipped out like pennies from a torn pocket. Her name was Evelyn. She was 42. Divorced. No kids. She used to paint. She didn't anymore. And no, she didn't think she missed it, but that could have been a lie. Julian didn't ask her out. There was no declaration, no text with a smiley face and a question mark. Their connection just deepened, week by week, through conversations that were both aimless and intimate. One night, when the city was soaked in fog and Evelyn had too much wine in her voice, she said, "You're too young to understand what it means to be invisible." And Julian replied, "Maybe, but I see you anyway." That was the second time she smiled. From then on, it became a ritual. They never planned it, never named it, but it was there, this unspoken pull, drawing them to the same places. He'd bring her books he thought she'd like, and she'd bring him pastries from some hidden corner of the city, as if that was how she could show affection without admitting it. They never touched, never hinted, but the energy between them crackled like live wires stretched too thin. Julian didn't tell anyone, not because he was ashamed, but because he didn't know what it was yet. And maybe, just maybe, because part of him was afraid that putting it into words would shatter whatever fragile thing they were building. Then came the night they sat on her apartment balcony, rain pelting the awning above them, drinking cheap red wine out of mismatched mugs. Evelyn had just told a story about how her ex-husband once sold one of her paintings without asking, and Julian had cursed louder than she did. She laughed, leaned back, and looked at him the way people do when they're about to cross a line they can't uncross. "Why are you really here, Julian?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "Because I'm tired of people my age pretending they're deep when they're just scared." "You don't pretend." She blinked, and for a moment, her guard dropped completely. Her voice was almost a whisper. "I don't let people see me anymore. I didn't think I could." Julian reached out, not for her hand, but for the empty mug she'd set down, brushing her fingers in the process. It wasn't a kiss, but it might as well have been. Neither of them spoke after that. Not about feelings, not about boundaries, but everything had shifted. It wasn't love. Not yet. But it wasn't nothing either. It was a beginning. Julian began counting the weeks instead of the days, not because it gave him a sense of order, but because something about Evelyn felt too large for days, too strange to be ordinary. Their meetings had evolved into something silent and certain, something that didn't need planning or labeling. They spoke like two people who had signed a contract no one else knew about, a contract made up of patience, honesty, and long glances that always stopped just short of becoming confessions. And yet, even with that quiet intimacy, there was no immunity from the real world, which remained loud, suspicious, and uninterested in subtleties. The first crack came in the form of a misjudged moment. He'd stayed too long in her apartment one Sunday morning, lying on her couch reading a book she once said she hated, half listening to the sound of her making coffee in the kitchen. She walked into the room, wearing a long sweatshirt and nothing else, hair tied back, mouth unreadable, and when she saw him looking at her like that meant something, she dropped her eyes and said, "You should be careful." He didn't respond. Not because he didn't understand, but because he did. That was the first time he felt the weight of her fear, not the general kind that comes from living in a chaotic world, but the specific kind that comes from knowing how people love to punish what they don't understand. Julian wasn't ashamed, but he started walking home faster at night and started looking over his shoulder at the cafe windows just in case someone he knew happened to be watching. He didn't think it would matter until it did. The professor he worked under, a dry old man named Hawthorne who believed everything post, 1970 was intellectual garbage, pulled Julian into his office one afternoon with a manila folder and a concerned expression. It wasn't about work. It was about gossip. Someone had seen him leaving an apartment building in the East End at sunrise. Someone else had seen him having lunch with a woman old enough to be his mother, and while Hawthorne didn't name names or directly accuse, his tone dripped with that academic disgust reserved for scandal, the kind of scandal that gets whispered in department lounges and eventually becomes legend. Julian didn't say anything. He didn't deny it. He left the office and went straight to Evelyn's place without calling first. She answered the door with paint on her hands. She had started painting again, not every day, not seriously, but enough for the room to smell faintly of turpentine and something alive. When he told her about the rumors, about the conversation with Hawthorne, her first instinct was to retreat, not physically, but mentally. He saw it in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened like she had rehearsed this moment, like she knew eventually someone would try to turn her into a problem. She didn't panic, but she did close the windows and turn off the music. Then she poured a drink. "I'm not your mistake to learn from, Julian," she said, voice calm but sharp. "You're not," he said quickly. "This isn't about that. I'm not running from this." She studied him like he was some strange object she didn't know whether to keep or put away in a drawer. Then she asked, "And if they force you to choose?" "No one's forcing anything," he replied. But that wasn't true. That week, the text started. Anonymous numbers. Lines like, "Does she even know what people say about her?" And "You're embarrassing yourself." Some of it was clearly from people his age, some from numbers with area codes he didn't recognize. At first, he blocked them, but they kept coming. One of them included a photo, not explicit, just the two of them at the park, sitting too close on a bench, both smiling. He showed it to Evelyn, who didn't look surprised. "It was bound to happen," she said. "It always does." She told him about a relationship she had years ago, right after the divorce, a man who was 10 years younger, not 20, but still enough for the whispers to start. She said she ended it before the whispers turned into screams, before she had to defend the right to feel anything again. She said people always pretended their concern was moral, but it never was. It was control. Then she asked if Julian wanted to leave before it got worse. He didn't. But the messages kept arriving, and then came a phone call, not to him, but to her. Her office line, a woman's voice, said she was just calling as a concerned citizen, said she'd seen Evelyn with someone who looked very young, said she thought the university might want to know what kind of relationships were forming between staff and students, even if unofficial. Evelyn wasn't on staff, but she had once guest lectured in a studio course, and the implication was clear enough to rattle her. When she told him about the call, she didn't cry. She just said, "We won't get to keep this much longer, will we?" Julian walked over, stood in front of her, touched her wrist, and said, "Maybe not. But I'm not giving it up because they said so." Her eyes didn't soften. Not immediately. But her hand turned upward beneath his, and her fingers curled around his like they hadn't in weeks. That night they didn't go out. They stayed in, phones turned off, curtains drawn. She painted for hours, stopping only to bring him tea, her hands still stained with color. When she finally joined him on the couch, she didn't speak, and neither did he. But they both knew things were changing. Not because they wanted them to, but because nothing stays untouched for long. The next morning, someone slid a letter under her door. No return address. No signature. Just a single sentence. "Everyone sees you." She left it on the counter and made breakfast like it didn't matter. But it did. And neither of them said a word. Evelyn began locking the windows at night. It wasn't out of fear, not exactly, but because some part of her couldn't stand the idea of being seen without her knowing it. The rhythm they had built, that quiet repetition of shared time and space, had started to shift. She kept her phone on silent more often, checked the peephole before opening the door even when she was expecting him, and started closing her laptop whenever he entered the room, not out of secrecy, but as if she were trying to make her digital life disappear in front of him. Julian noticed every change, but he said nothing. He had grown used to silence meaning more than words, and even now, the gaps between their conversations seemed charged with something deliberate. What replaced casual questions and spontaneous laughter were late-night talks that slipped into corners they hadn't explored before. She told him about a painting she had thrown away because her ex-husband had called it indulgent. He told her about the first time he lied to his parents about why he stayed out so late, how it felt more like self-preservation than rebellion. They both confessed things without asking for anything in return. Evelyn spoke about friendships that had ended the moment she'd stopped attending dinner parties, the way her world had contracted until even her voicemail felt invasive. Julian described how even the people he trusted most now offered unsolicited advice about what kind of woman he should be with, their voices always tinged with something they thought sounded like concern, but felt more like control. They stopped meeting in public altogether. He still came to her apartment, always entering through the back stairwell, always leaving after midnight. She kept the lights dim, not to hide anything from him, but to hide everything from anyone who might be watching. Their relationship wasn't built on drama or chaos. It wasn't reckless, but it had become fragile under pressure, shaped by rules they hadn't agreed on but followed anyway. One night, as he helped her carry groceries up the back stairs, Julian heard someone's footsteps pause on the landing above. He didn't look up, didn't make eye contact, but Evelyn did. A man in a gray coat, holding a small paper bag, stood there long enough to register what he was seeing. Julian, too young, holding too much. Evelyn, older, calm, and not hiding. The man turned without a word and walked back down. She didn't say anything until they were inside, and even then, she didn't ask the question that was clearly waiting to be asked. She simply opened the cabinet, put away the food, and said, "People see what they want. That doesn't mean they know what they're seeing." Julian nodded, but the quiet between them felt different this time. Not angry, not resentful, just aware. The next day, he returned to campus, and something in the air had changed. Friends who used to greet him without pause suddenly seemed hesitant. A couple of people avoided eye contact. A girl from one of his classes asked casually if he was still seeing that artist lady, as if the words didn't mean anything, as if they weren't wrapped in judgment. Julian shrugged it off, but by the time he sat down at his usual spot in the library, he realized something had happened. The photo that had been taken in the park, just the two of them on a bench, had been posted to a student forum. The caption didn't say anything explicit, but the comments were full of assumptions, most of them cruel, many of them stupid, and some of them too close to the truth. No one used her name, but that didn't matter. They knew enough. Julian didn't tell Evelyn that night. Instead, he asked about her paintings, tried to distract them both with color and form, as if brushstrokes could replace what neither of them wanted to say out loud. But she sensed it anyway. Halfway through dinner, she looked at him and said, "Someone saw us again, didn't they?" He nodded. She didn't ask for details. She just leaned back in her chair and said, "I used to think that growing older meant people stopped caring about the things that didn't affect them. I was wrong." They sat in silence for a long time before Julian finally said, "I'm not going to stop seeing you because someone else doesn't like it." She didn't answer right away. Then, finally, "You might not get to decide that." A few days later, it was no longer a question. Evelyn had an open studio night, something she hadn't done in years. She didn't tell Julian until the day before. "It's not an exhibit, just a walkthrough. A few people from the gallery are coming. Former students, mostly. Some colleagues." He offered to go, and she hesitated, but eventually agreed. "If you want. But don't stand too close." The night of the event, the gallery was filled with soft music and the sound of clinking glasses, people drifting between canvases and half-finished sculptures. Evelyn moved through the room like someone who had trained herself to look comfortable in uncomfortable spaces. Julian stayed near the back wall, letting her have the attention without interference. She looked beautiful, but not in a way he could say out loud, "Not here." Halfway through the evening, she stopped to talk to a man wearing a tan blazer, mid-50s, sharp haircut, clearly someone who still called people kid in conversation. Julian wasn't paying close attention until the man glanced across the room, narrowed his eyes, and said something that made Evelyn stiffen. She didn't look at Julian, but the damage was already done. The man gave a half smile and walked away. When she finally came back to Julian, she said, "That was an old colleague. He said it's brave of me to bring my personal life to professional spaces." Julian asked, "Did he mean it?" She replied, "He never does." They left early. That night, she said she didn't feel like painting. That was the first time she asked him not to stay. The invitation was printed on thick paper, cream-colored, the kind you don't throw away immediately. Julian found it in his campus mailbox, tucked between flyers for internships he wasn't going to apply to and pamphlets for lectures he had already skipped. It was addressed to him by name, which was rare and, even stranger, it came from the art department. It was an end-of-term gala hosted downtown, some university-sponsored affair meant to showcase student-faculty collaboration and highlight local artists connected to the program. Evelyn's name wasn't mentioned, but she had been invited separately, and she brought it up that same evening, holding her own envelope as if it were something fragile, not because she cared about the event, but because she understood what kind of space it would be. She hadn't planned on going. Julian didn't say much when she told him, but later that night, while they were cleaning up the kitchen, he asked if she would come if he was there. She didn't answer immediately, only said, "You know what kind of people go to those things." He replied, "So what?" Her tone didn't change. "So some people don't forget what they've heard, even when it's none of their business. Julian didn't press her, but she showed up anyway. The night of the gala was warm and loud. The building was one of those refurbished mansions the university liked to pretend made them cultured. Inside, there were tables covered in linen, name cards in careful cursive, glasses never more than half empty, and conversations that looped around the same people and the same safe compliments. Evelyn entered quietly, dressed in black, her hair pinned up with the kind of precision that looked deliberate. Julian was already there, standing near the bar, surrounded by classmates who were pretending to be indifferent about everything. He saw her before she saw him and moved to meet her halfway across the room. She didn't smile, but her eyes didn't waver. They didn't touch. For most of the evening, they kept their distance. She spoke with people she used to work with, nodded at people who clearly hadn't expected her to show, and moved through the room with that same calm restraint that always made Julian feel like she was choosing every second deliberately. He joined a group near the student exhibit, forcing himself into conversations about brush technique and theme development, none of which he cared about in that moment. He watched her across the room, and she watched him too, both of them careful, both of them trying to measure how much space they were allowed to take up. At some point, someone decided to give a speech. The dean stepped up to a small platform at the front of the hall and began thanking people by name. Faculty, donors, visiting artists. Evelyn was mentioned, politely, briefly, just her last name and a vague nod to her contribution to the department's legacy. People clapped, but they didn't look at her. Julian did. She stood near a window, hands folded, not reacting. When the speech ended, the crowd thinned slightly as waiters began refilling glasses, and that was when everything cracked open. A professor Julian barely knew walked over to him, wine in hand, wearing that academic grin that always sounded like a challenge. "So," he said, glancing across the room, "you and Evelyn, what exactly is that situation?" Julian didn't answer. The man laughed. "Come on, I'm not judging. I'm just curious. There's been talk." Julian looked at him and said, "Then you already know what you came here to find out." The man raised an eyebrow. "So it's true." Julian didn't move. That was when someone else joined them. A woman from Evelyn's former department, someone who had once guest-taught one of Julian's courses. She spoke without waiting for an invitation. "It's not about whether it's true. It's about the optics and the ethics." Julian finally spoke. "There's nothing unethical about two adults being with each other." She leaned in slightly. "Maybe not legally, but reputationally? That's different. For both of you." Other people began turning their heads. Julian didn't lower his voice. "Then maybe the problem isn't the relationship. Maybe the problem is the people watching it like it's their property." The conversation caught attention. The music was still playing, but a small cluster of people had started listening. A few students, one of the gallery curators, someone with a clipboard. Julian didn't care. He looked over and saw Evelyn watching him. She had heard. She had stopped mid-conversation and was standing alone now. He didn't move toward her, but he said her name clearly, without hesitation. "Evelyn and I are together." It was loud enough for the people nearby to hear. A few reacted. Some didn't. A couple of them laughed under their breath. No one interrupted him. "She's not a mistake. She's not a story for people to gossip about." Then he turned and walked toward her. Evelyn didn't speak right away. When he reached her, she said quietly, "You didn't have to say that." He replied, "I know." "Then why?" He didn't hesitate. "Because I didn't want to act like you were something I had to hide." Her voice barely moved above a whisper. "You just made it real." He nodded. It already was. They didn't stay long after that. She drove them home. They didn't talk on the way. Back at her apartment, she locked the door, set down her keys, and poured herself a glass of water. Then she looked at him. "I don't know if I can carry the weight of what people are going to turn this into." Julian sat down. "You don't have to. I can carry some of it too." For a long time, she didn't answer. Then she said, "This might not survive." He said, "Maybe." She asked, "Then why do you keep staying?" He replied, "Because I want to be here, even if it breaks." They didn't touch, but they didn't walk away either. They didn't see each other for 6 days after the gala. Julian didn't call. Evelyn didn't text. It wasn't silence out of anger, and it wasn't the kind of distance that ends something. It was space made out of necessity, out of fatigue, out of the quiet understanding that pressure does not always lead to collapse, but sometimes to stillness. On the seventh day, she sent him a photo of a painting she hadn't planned on finishing. It wasn't titled, and it didn't come with a message. It was a photo of something unfinished, but no longer ignored. Julian stared at it for longer than he meant to, then put on his jacket and walked the 40 minutes to her apartment without checking the weather or the time. When she opened the door, she looked different, not in her face or her clothes, but in the way she stood. He walked in, and neither of them said anything at first. She poured him coffee without asking, then leaned against the counter like nothing had happened, like this wasn't the first time in years she had let someone show up without warning and still wanted them to stay. He looked around and noticed the painting in the photo, now leaning against the far wall, not quite dry. It was dark and uneven and angry in some places. It wasn't beautiful, but it wasn't trying to be. That was what made it matter. She finally broke the silence. My sister called. Julian didn't interrupt. She saw the photo online. Not the first one. The one from the gala. Someone posted it on a faculty blog. I didn't even know those people still had blogs. He set the cup down. What did she say? Evelyn shrugged. She asked if it was true. I told her yes. He waited. She asked if you were using me. I told her no. She asked if I was sure. I didn't answer. He didn't react. I get it. She said I should be embarrassed. Julian looked at her. Are you? She didn't look away. No, but I'm tired. He nodded. Me too. She sat down across from him. What do you want this to be? He didn't answer right away. I don't know. I don't need it to be forever. I just need it to be real. Her voice was quiet. It is. They sat with that for a while. Not as a solution, but as a truth that didn't need to be decorated. Then she asked something she hadn't asked before. What happens now? He looked at her and said, we talk to the people we owe honesty to. We stop pretending it's not happening. We stop acting like it's some secret shame. She raised an eyebrow. And if they react badly? He answered without pause. That's on them. The next day, Julian told his parents. He expected anger, confusion, disbelief. What he got was a silence that felt like waiting. His mother asked if she had children. His father asked if she was manipulating him. He said no to both. Then they asked the question he'd been expecting. Why her? He didn't give them a poetic answer. He just said, because I feel more like myself around her than I do around anyone else. It didn't end in resolution. It didn't need to, but it was out in the open. Evelyn didn't have anyone left to tell, except the people who had already made up their minds. She called the gallery director and told him she wasn't renewing her part-time residency. She didn't explain why. She just said she didn't want to keep standing in spaces where she wasn't allowed to exist without apology. Julian kept going to class. His reputation didn't collapse. It just shifted. A few people looked at him differently. Some asked questions they didn't need the answers to. Others avoided him altogether. He let them. The ones who mattered stayed. 3 weeks after the gala, Evelyn invited him to a wedding. It was a small event in a coastal town 3 hours away, a friend from her old life who didn't care about age or gossip. The invitation had been sitting on her desk for months. She hadn't planned on going, but now she wanted to. They drove up together, not because they were trying to prove anything, but because it made sense. At the reception, people asked the usual questions. Some gave curious glances. One woman, maybe in her 50s, raised her glass and said, "Good for you both," without irony. That was enough. Later, during the dancing, Julian stepped outside. The sun was starting to drop behind the hills. Evelyn joined him a few minutes later. They didn't say anything for a while. Then she looked over and asked, "Do you think we'll still be doing this in a year?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Maybe. Maybe not. But I'll still mean it, even if we're not." She nodded. That's fair. They didn't dance after that. They just stood there until it got cold. The following month, Evelyn sold 3 paintings to a collector who didn't ask about her personal life. Julian submitted an essay to a journal and didn't mention her in it. They kept seeing each other. They also started spending more time apart. It wasn't distance. It was reality. One night, Julian asked, "Would you tell me if you wanted to end it?" She looked him in the eye and said, "Would you listen if I did?" He said, "Yes." Neither of them said it was over, but neither of them said it would last. The story never got a final answer, but it didn't disappear. Evelyn kept painting. Julian kept walking to her apartment. Sometimes he stayed. Sometimes he didn't. Nobody posted photos anymore, but people still looked. And they let them, because this wasn't a mistake. It was theirs.